The envelope sat on my kitchen counter, cream-colored, thick and heavy with intention. My name, Serafina Whitlock, was written in Marin's neat, almost surgical handwriting, and beneath it, the words, "Dinner at our home, 7 p.m." I held it in my hands longer than I should have, feeling the weight of decades settle on my shoulders. Theodore would have laughed at me, shaking his head, calling me melodramatic. But he was gone, and the silence around me felt louder than any words Marin could write. I stared at the envelope, thinking about the house we had built together brick by brick, and the countless nights we had spent planning every detail of our lives. Raising children, managing accounts, renovating the lake property, saving relentlessly for the future, everything Theodore and I had done, everything I had done. And now this dinner invitation felt less like a gesture of respect and more like a summons to some private tribunal, an evaluation of what remained of me. I took a deep breath and set the envelope on the counter. I pressed my fingers to my temples, recalling the tension that always hovered during family gatherings. Marin, with her precise tone and sharp eyes, had the uncanny ability to make me feel small, to reduce a lifetime of dedication to a single-word widow. Callum, ever the opportunist, would flank her with smirks and veiled jabs. And yet, there was Linnea, my granddaughter, the only one who ever looked at me as if I were more than the shadow of her father. I poured myself a cup of tea, letting the steam curl around my face. Theodore's absence was a constant ache, but the thought of facing my daughter's cold stare and my son's quiet arrogance felt like a weight pressing against my chest. Still, I knew I had to go. I had spent too many years acquiescing, bending to expectations, and letting their judgments shape my sense of self. Tonight, I reminded myself I would not. I thought about my outfit, my posture, the careful balance between dignity and approachability. I would not allow Marin's words to dictate my emotions. I straightened the shoulders of my blouse, touched the locket Theodore had given me decades ago, and whispered to myself that composure was my armor. I would enter that house fully aware of the dynamics, fully aware of what was at stake, and fully prepared to observe before I acted. As I slipped into my coat and glanced at the mirror, I felt a strange mixture of apprehension and anticipation. The sun had begun to dip behind the rooftops, casting long shadows over the suburban streets that led to Marin's home. Each step toward the car felt like walking into history, into a story I had lived but never fully controlled. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and placed the envelope gently on the passenger side. The engine hummed to life, and I exhaled slowly, allowing the tension in my chest to ebb just enough for clarity. The drive ahead was short, the streets familiar, but the events to come were anything but predictable. The house gleamed in the fading light as I pulled into the driveway, its pristine windows reflecting everything I had sacrificed. I stepped out of the car, straightened my coat once more, and walked up the steps. Every creak of the porch under my feet reminded me of the life Theodore and I had built, a life I intended to reclaim if necessary. Inside, the air smelled faintly of roasted garlic and polished wood. I paused at the threshold, observing Marin bustling in her usual precise way. Callum leaning casually against the counter, and the table set with meticulous attention. I could feel the tension radiating from them, the invisible lines drawn, the judgments unspoken but palpable. I let myself smile, a small, measured smile. Tonight, I would enter their world on my own terms, and the rules of engagement had just shifted. The moment I stepped into the dining room, the air felt tighter, sharper than I remembered. Marin's eyes flicked toward me, her expression carefully neutral, but her lips curved in a faint, controlled smirk. Callum leaned casually against the doorway, wineglass in hand, and for a split second, I felt like an intruder in a house I had helped build in my mind and in reality. "Just sit quietly, you widow," Marin said, her voice calm, deliberate, as if she had rehearsed it countless times. The words hit me with the precision of a scalpel. My hand tightened around the edge of the chair I had pulled out for myself. Callum chuckled that low, self-satisfied sound, and the rest of the room murmured in quiet approval, as though they were applauding her audacity. I sat my fingers pressed into the polished wood of the table, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel it, all the sting, the disbelief, the simmering anger. Flashbacks hit me unbidden nights, spent working through bills and tax forms, while Marin and Callum played in the yard, weekends skipped to save for renovations, and every small compromise made to preserve the family's wealth and stability. Theodore and I had sacrificed, bent, and labored to create the foundation they now stepped across without a second thought. I forced myself to exhale slowly, to center my thoughts. This was their world for the moment. Their arrogance had created a bubble around them, and I would not let it burst me. I studied their faces, the practiced indifference, the faint smirk, the barely concealed glee in Callum's eyes. They believed I was powerless, that the years of effort planning and silent labor counted for nothing. Marin poured wine into everyone's glasses, her movements precise, almost theatrical. Callum toyed with the bread basket, flicking crumbs onto the tablecloth with casual disregard. Every gesture, every glance was meant to remind me of the role they had assigned me, the quiet widow, a spectator at my own family's legacy. And for a moment, I felt the weight of it, the unfairness, the erosion of authority I had never sought, but had earned nonetheless. I allowed myself a brief inward smile. They had underestimated me as so many had in the past. Their mockery, their attempt to diminish my presence, was transparent. I had survived worse, endured more subtle cruelties and open betrayals. Theodore had trusted me, the estate had trusted me, and in that trust lay a quiet, unshakable power that they could not see. I reached for my water glass, lifted it to my lips, and let the cool liquid ground me. The murmurs around the table continued, but I did not flinch. Every glance they threw my way, every whispered jest was noted and stored not in anger, but in calculated awareness. This was a performance, and I was fully present, fully awake, fully prepared to let the next move be mine. As the main course was set before us, Marin's smile remained perfectly practiced. Callum's laughter, a low, arrogant hum, and I realized something that settled deep in my chest tonight would not be about yielding or appeasing. It would be about observation, calculation, and restraint. I set my fork down lightly, a subtle signal to myself that I was ready. The evening had only just begun, and my next step would determine everything. I stood slowly, careful not to draw attention, and let my chair scrape against the hardwood floor with deliberate slowness. Marin's eyes lifted just long enough to register my movement, and Callum let out a faint, amused hum, as if this was the punchline to some cruel joke. I gathered my napkin, smoothed the creases in my blouse, and turned toward the door. The apple tart I had baked with care for Theodore sat untouched on the counter, a silent testament to my effort. My thoughtfulness, my presence ignored entirely. The cool evening air hit my face as I stepped onto the porch. The muffled laughter and clinking of silverware behind me faded into the distance. I inhaled deeply, letting the tension in my shoulders release, letting the weight of their words and sneers settle into something less sharp, less urgent. For the first time that evening, I felt the calm of choice, the quiet power of walking away on my own terms. Each step down the driveway carried a strange mixture of pain and liberation. Pain because the people I had loved and raised, the people I had helped shape, were so quick to dismiss me. Liberation because in that dismissal lay the seed of control I had yet to fully acknowledge. They believed the role they had assigned me, and for now I let them hold that illusion while I began to reclaim the narrative. I thought about the years that had brought me here. Theodore and I, side by side, navigating debts, renovations, and long nights of planning futures our children barely appreciated. Skipping vacations, stretching every dollar, sacrificing personal comforts for the household and for them. And now, decades later, a simple remark. "Just sit quietly, you widow," was meant to erase all of it, reduce me to a shadow. They had not counted on me seeing beyond the words. They had not counted on the knowledge that I had seen patterns, known intentions, and prepared quietly for the eventuality of their arrogance. I reached the car and pressed my hand against the cool metal, pausing to gather myself. The engine roared to life, a small grounding sound that mirrored the steady pulse in my chest. I drove slowly, deliberately through familiar streets, each turn, reminding me of the stability Theodore and I had built, the neighborhood we had called home, the life that was still mine, whether they acknowledged it or not. In the solitude of the car, I allowed my mind to drift through potential strategies, possibilities, contingencies. Observation without action, patience without surrender, restraint without compromise. These were tools I had refined over years of managing accounts, properties, and household affairs. Tonight was not the time for confrontation. Not yet. Tonight was the moment to measure, to understand, and to prepare for the shift that I could feel approaching. By the time I pulled into my driveway at home, the calm had settled over me fully. A new rhythm in my chest, a quiet pulse of authority I had not allowed myself to feel in years. The door closed behind me with a soft click, sealing off their world and leaving mine intact, and waiting for the right moment. The tart remained untouched. The dinner concluded without a scene, and I finally allowed myself to exhale fully, knowing that the next step, when it came, would be entirely mine to define. I sank into the armchair in my living room, letting the quiet wrap around me like a familiar blanket. The evening's tension still clung to my shoulders, but now it was accompanied by a sharper awareness, a clarity that only comes when the past presses against the present. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift back to Theodore, to the life we had built together from scratch. I remembered the first property we bought, a modest house with chipped paint and a sagging porch, and how we had poured every spare dollar and every ounce of energy into fixing it, making it ours. Theodore had joked about it endlessly, calling me the perfectionist, and I had laughed, ignoring the long nights spent balancing the checkbook, negotiating with contractors, and convincing our children to pitch in without complaint. Those nights had been exhausting, but they had been ours, and in them lay the foundation of everything I had fought for. Raising Marin and Callum had demanded its own quiet sacrifices. I had attended every school meeting, every recital, every scraped knee and late-night emergency with the patience of someone who understood that the future we were building depended on the present we endured. I had worked tirelessly to balance household and business responsibilities, often at the expense of my own comfort, my own desires. Theodore had noticed, of course he always did, but the children, blissfully unaware of the weight behind every decision, had taken for granted what had been given. I thought about the compromises, the calculated risks we had taken together, from investments that could have failed spectacularly to vacations skipped so that we could funnel every cent back into the properties we now owned. Those choices had required trust, discipline, and sometimes quiet courage. And yet, despite all of it tonight, Marin had attempted to reduce me to a single diminutive word, widow. The sting of that word still lingered, but it no longer felt like defeat. Instead, it sparked a resolve that had been quietly simmering for decades. I realized that every late night, every compromise, every ounce of energy I had poured into this family and this legacy had prepared me for this exact moment. I had not been powerless all these years. I had been waiting quietly, observing, quietly preparing. Theodore had trusted me with everything, even when the children's intentions had been less than pure. He had known I would see the patterns, understand the risks, and act when the time was right. I now understood what that trust had meant. It was not simply permission, it was responsibility, a mandate to protect the life we had built and the assets we had nurtured together. I sat back, feeling a weight lift from my chest and a spark ignite in its place. This was no longer about hurt or humiliation. It was about clarity, about authority, about reclaiming the agency that had been overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated. I resolved then, fully and unflinchingly, that I would act not out of vengeance, but out of rightful stewardship. The past had brought me here. The next step would determine how I shaped the future, and I would not hesitate when the moment arrived. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every small sound feel amplified. I wandered into the study, drawn by the pull of memory and habit. The drawer in the corner, the one Theodore had always kept locked or at least off limits to Maren and Callum, called to me. It was a space full of old receipts, forgotten photographs, and documents we never meant to display. My fingers hesitated at the handle, a mix of anticipation and apprehension curling in my stomach. I pulled the drawer open slowly, half expecting to find nothing more than papers I had filed away years ago. But there it was, a thick envelope, pristine and out of place, labeled simply Serafina, in Theodore's unmistakable hand. My pulse quickened. He had never been sentimental with words, never left notes just to be remembered. Everything he did had always been measured, practical, and precise. This envelope, I realized instantly, was different. I slid it out and placed it carefully on the desk. The seal was intact, the weight of it deliberate. I opened it slowly, letting my fingers trace the edges, absorbing the moment, understanding instinctively that this was a turning point. Inside, nestled beneath a single sheet of paper, were stacks of notarized documents, deeds, account statements, investment records, titles for the lake property and the downtown condo. My hands trembled as I flipped through them. Every property Theodore and I had ever acquired, every investment we had nurtured, every asset we had built together, had been transferred legally into my name. The letter on top was brief but precise. Theodore's handwriting was exact, each word deliberate. If you are reading this, know that I foresaw the challenges you would face. All assets are under your control. Use them wisely. Protect what we built. Do not be swayed by anyone who seeks to diminish your authority. I sank into the chair, staring at the documents as if they were artifacts from a different life. Shock washed over me first, a cold, biting realization of the power suddenly at my fingertips. And then came a wave of empowerment, a rising tide that filled the empty spaces left by doubt and humiliation. For years I had been invisible in my own family's eyes, dismissed as a widow, as someone secondary, someone who had already been assumed to yield. Now the ledger of my life, the record of our decades of labor, declared otherwise. I thought immediately of Maren's words at dinner, the casual cruelty with which she had tried to erase me. I thought of Callum's smirk, of the smug sense of entitlement that had allowed them to believe they were entitled to everything we had built, and I felt a shift, subtle at first, a recalibration of the balance of power. Theirs had always been the assumed dominance. Now, quietly, it had passed into my hands. I ran my fingers over the edge of the documents again, feeling the cool weight of authority, and realized that I had been waiting for this moment without even knowing it. Theodore had known it would come. He had planned, measured, and ensured that when the time was right, I would be fully capable of exercising control, not impulsively, not angrily, but decisively. I rose from the chair, still holding the envelope, and moved toward the window. The street outside was calm, indifferent to the shift that had just occurred within these walls. A plan began to form, precise and deliberate. The children had assumed they controlled the narrative, but they had no idea how thoroughly the stage had been set. Tonight, I would hold this power quietly, observe, and prepare. Tomorrow, when the world shifted, I would act. Theodore had given me the tools, and finally, I was ready to use them. The phone felt heavier in my hand than it should have, as if the weight of the past and the future were pressing down through the receiver. I dialed Nolan Harris's number, the one man who had known Theodore and me since the early days of the first property purchase. He answered on the third ring, his voice gruff with sleep but alert when he heard my name. "Nolan, it's Serafina," I said, trying to keep my tone even measured. "I need to review some documents with you. It's urgent." A pause. "Serafina. All right, I'll be there in 20. I hung up and sat back, letting the silence of the study surround me. Theodore had trusted Nolan completely, and I knew why. Meticulous, honest, and fiercely loyal, Nolan had been with us through every acquisition, every contract, every late-night dispute. If anyone could validate what Theodore had left me, it would be him. 20 minutes later, he arrived, briefcase in hand, the familiar scent of leather and old paper following him into the room. I spread the envelope and its contents across the table, and Nolan's eyebrows rose as he scanned the first documents. "Well," he said, slowly leaning back, "this is comprehensive, full control. House investments, lake property. The downtown condo accounts all under your name. Theodore didn't leave anything to chance." I felt a shiver run through me, equal parts awe and incredulity. All these years I had believed I was preparing for the worst, protecting what I could, but Theodore had already anticipated the exact scenario. He had ensured I wouldn't just survive. I could wield control decisively, legally, without question. I see that I said, touching the edges of the notarized documents. He really planned for everything, didn't he? Nolan nodded. Every clause, every contingency, every eventuality that could arise from family disputes. He trusted you to execute his plan when the time came. And from what I see here, you have that authority in full. Flashbacks of Theodore flickered through my mind, evenings hunched over ledgers while I brewed coffee to keep us awake. The quiet conversations about what to do if things went wrong, the way he had looked at me with steady eyes and a hint of a smile, as if to say, "I have faith in you." That faith now felt tangible, heavy in my hands, folded into the stack of papers before me. I leaned forward, scanning the documents again. Tax forms, property deeds, account authorizations, letters of attorney, everything Theodore had arranged was precise, complete, and enforceable. It struck me how methodical he had been, how careful, how he had foreseen not just the world's randomness, but the potential greed of our children. "We need a plan," I said, finally meeting Nolan's gaze. "I can't act recklessly. I need to understand every legal boundary, every safeguard. I need to be prepared before they realize what's happening." He nodded, tapping a pen against the edge of his briefcase. "We'll go through this line by line. You have the power, Serafina. The law is on your side, but timing and strategy will determine how effectively you use it." I exhaled slowly, letting the words sink in. The tools were in my hands. The stage was set. And now it was a matter of patience, observation, and deliberate action. Theodore had built the foundation, and I was ready to raise the walls, secure and unyielding. The morning light was pale and still as I settled at my desk, the stack of documents neatly organized in front of me. Nolan had walked me through every clause, every signature, every contingency the night before. Today, the plan moved from paper to action. I reached for the first set of account authorizations and signed, confirming my control over the family's primary accounts. A quiet satisfaction settled in me as the electronic confirmations pinged across my inbox, successfully executed, irrevocable, and entirely legal. I made a cup of coffee, hands steady, despite the subtle thrill rising through my chest. The documents that had once felt like a weight of responsibility now felt like instruments of authority. Each click, each verified transfer, each confirmation message reinforced the truth I had known, but had only now fully realized Theodore had prepared me for this, and I was ready. By late morning, the first signs of disruption appeared. A text from Maren blinked on my phone. Why can't I access the accounts I need to make payments? I smiled faintly, resisting the urge to reply immediately. Callum had called his assistant multiple times, each attempt more frantic than the last. I watched their confusion build quietly, savoring the slow, inevitable crescendo of panic that came from losing control they had never truly earned. I leaned back in my chair and let myself observe. Their arrogance had blinded them to the possibility that I could act, that I had not only anticipated their ambitions, but had prepared a framework to contain them. Each failed login, each frozen account, each unexpected notification was a tiny, precise reminder that the balance of power had shifted. They had assumed they could manipulate. They had assumed I would remain passive, and now that assumption was collapsing. Linnea, my granddaughter, sent a tentative message later, unaware of the full scale of the actions I had taken. Her words were cautious, almost fearful. "Grandma, something's happening. Are you okay?" My chest softened at the thought of her, the only member of the family who had ever looked at me with genuine respect and concern. I reassured her briefly, allowing a small connection of warmth to anchor me amid the chaos. Maren's calls began to multiply, short bursts of irritation, followed by clipped threats. Callum's emails became increasingly panicked, some even questioning whether the legal documents could be real. I kept my responses minimal, letting the weight of reality press on them without interference. Watching them flounder, scrambling to understand why their privileges had evaporated overnight, provided a measure of satisfaction that was both measured and deliberate. I sipped my coffee slowly, feeling a strange combination of calm and exhilaration. The morning unfolded like a chessboard, each piece in motion, every pawn, rook, and knight accounted for. Theodore had always played the game with foresight, and now I was executing his strategy with precision, controlling the tempo, dictating the consequences. By mid-afternoon, I had reviewed every confirmation notice, every frozen account, every legal acknowledgement. The panic in their voices, the confusion in their messages, and the uncertainty in their faces when they spoke to one another from a distance marked the first wave of the storm I had quietly set in motion. I allowed myself a small smile, knowing this was only the beginning, the first tangible sign that the power balance had shifted irrevocably. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, casting the familiar shadows across my study, I leaned forward, fingers resting on the edge of the desk. I could sense the tension rising in their house across town, each heartbeat likely matching my own in disbelief and fury. The moment was unfolding exactly as Theodore had envisioned, and as I prepared for the next stage, I felt a clarity I had not known in years. The house was quiet in a way that felt different from before, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. I sat at my desk, documents spread out before me, and began the painstaking process of reviewing every financial record account statement and property ledger that Theodore had left. The power I had assumed was absolute suddenly revealed another layer, one that showed the depth of the deception Maren and Callum had woven over the years. It started with the accounts I had activated the day before. The first anomaly was subtle, a series of small transfers that should have required my authorization, but had been executed without it. At first, I thought perhaps it was an error, a glitch in the system. But as I dug deeper, the pattern became undeniable. Callum had been funneling funds into side ventures he never disclosed using corporate accounts as collateral for personal loans and quietly redirecting investment returns into accounts under his own name. Maren's involvement became apparent almost simultaneously. Her signature, faint but unmistakable, appeared on documents she had no legal right to sign. Contracts, amendments to account permissions, and property agreements, each one carefully forged or manipulated to give her access to assets that were never hers to control. The audacity of it left a chill in my chest, but I allowed myself only a quiet exhale. I did not feel rage, I felt clarity. I began cataloging every irregularity in a separate folder, meticulously noting dates, amounts, and the individuals involved. Each entry reinforced the scope of their deception and the recklessness with which they had assumed I would remain oblivious. Theodore's foresight had been extraordinary. He had built safeguards into every corner of the estate, measures that now allowed me to expose these actions with precision without leaving a single opening for doubt or argument. As I worked, memories surfaced, the late nights when I reconciled accounts while the children slept, the trust I had placed in them to manage responsibilities responsibly, the small kindnesses I had overlooked in favor of structure and guidance. The contrast between those moments and their current greed and entitlement was stark. They had assumed inheritance was automatic, that my absence in daily management equated to ignorance, that the mantle of responsibility could be seized with arrogance alone. They were wrong. I paused to review the lake property records. Maren had attempted to refinance it without notifying me, including alterations to mortgage agreements and rental arrangements. Callum had hidden transfers of interest in a condominium they had managed for years. The evidence was undeniable, the timeline meticulous. I felt no rush to confront them immediately. The power was mine now, and timing would ensure maximum impact. I carefully placed the flagged documents into a separate binder, labeling each section with the level of severity and the legal implications. This was not a pursuit of revenge. It was a methodical preparation for accountability. I had spent decades building a life of integrity and foresight, and I would not compromise that by reacting impulsively or emotionally. With the binder complete, I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of what I had uncovered settle. The realization was stark. The children had overstepped every boundary, underestimating the very person they had sought to diminish. I had the means to correct the course, to restore order and justice, but I would do so on my own terms, maintaining the moral high ground they had long assumed I lacked. Every file, every note, every irregular transaction was now cataloged and ready. The storm I had begun to set in motion the day before was about to gain depth, and I would remain poised at its center, deliberate and unshaken, as the consequences began to unfold. I sat at my desk, the binder of discoveries open before me, and let the quiet settle in. The hum of the computer, the occasional ring of my phone, even the faint ticking of the wall clock, it all seemed amplified in the stillness. I had everything I needed, every piece of evidence, every account, frozen, every transfer verified. And yet I did nothing, not yet. I had learned long ago that power was most potent when paired with patience. Immediate confrontation might satisfy a fleeting sense of justice, but it would also alert them, allow them to scramble to cover tracks, to manipulate the narrative before the truth fully landed. No, it was better to let the tension simmer, to let anxiety rise naturally, like the slow heat of a kettle about to whistle. Across town, I imagined the household in disarray. Maren, checking balances, reloading pages, tapping her phone with increasing urgency. Callum, pacing back and forth, muttering half-formed explanations to no one in particular. I could almost hear Linnea's voice, tentative, asking quiet questions her parents didn't want her to ask. That girl had always seen through the facades, and I knew she would be caught between loyalty and confusion. I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. The subtle chaos unfolding was as much a lesson as it was a consequence. Years of arrogance, of entitlement, of assuming they could operate without oversight, they were reaping exactly what they had sown. And I, having cultivated restraint for decades, was the unseen hand guiding it all. I sipped my coffee slowly, each swallow, deliberate, letting the warmth settle in my chest and steady my mind. Strategic silence required a different kind of vigilance than action. I checked each notification, each email, each system alert, not to respond immediately, but to catalog reactions, observe patterns, and predict missteps. Every frustrated call from Marin, every confused email from Callum, every hesitant text from Linnea. These were the pulses of the situation, the rhythm of their growing awareness, and I measured each one carefully. I thought back to Theodore, to the quiet evenings when he had taught me the value of foresight. He had planned, meticulously accounted for every eventuality, and trusted me to execute the strategy when the time came. I had always believed that patience was a virtue, but now I understood it as a weapon precise and lethal in its own way. To strike too soon would diminish its impact. To wait to let the weight of inevitability settle in their minds would make the consequences unmistakable. Linnea sent a short message, mid-morning voice, trembling through the text. "Grandma, they're panicking. Are you okay?" I replied, gently assuring her I was fine, careful to shield her from the full scope of my actions. She needed to know someone was steady, someone she could trust, while the adults around her faltered. The day stretched on each hour, a careful balance of observation and restraint. I cataloged reactions, marked patterns, and considered the next moves. The storm I had set in motion was rising, building pressure naturally, and I was at its calm center, poised, deliberate, and unshakable. By late afternoon, I leaned back in my chair and let the weight of control settle fully around me. The first waves of panic had begun, subtle but undeniable, and I could feel the tension radiating through every message, every missed call, every frantic attempt at explanation. My patience was doing what immediate action never could. By mid-morning, the ripple I had set in motion became undeniable. Marin's first frantic email arrived short-clipped, laced with disbelief. "Why can't I access the checking account? This has to be a mistake." I read it once, then again, allowing the words to settle without a response. The calm that enveloped me stood in stark contrast to the panic that was beginning to bloom across town. Callum's voice came through the phone, taut and incredulous, as he barked at his assistant over a transfer that had inexplicably failed. Every attempt to manipulate or access funds hit a dead end. I could hear the rising frustration, even through the clipped, half-hearted explanations he tried to offer. Their disbelief was palpable, each failed login, each declined transaction a punctuation mark in the slow, inevitable lesson they had ignored for too long. I allowed myself a brief, satisfied exhale. The documents Theodore had prepared were meticulous, each clause designed to prevent interference, each authorization binding. The moment of shock was precisely what I had anticipated, and I watched from the edges, observing without interference, cataloging reactions for future reference. A short message from Linnea blinked on my phone. "Grandma, they're panicking. Something about money being gone. Are you okay?" I typed back simply, "I'm fine, sweetheart. Everything is under control." Her voice, even through text, carried the unease she had inherited from her parents, and I felt a quiet pang for her, the one in the family who had always shown integrity. She needed grounding, and I would provide it just enough to keep her safe while the others flailed. Across the lines of communication, Marin sent repeated messages, alternating between indignation and veiled threats, assuming I would respond and negotiate. Callum escalated differently, phoning Banks advisors and anyone who might clarify the error they believed had occurred. I watched each misstep with measured detachment. Their arrogance, their assumption that they controlled the flow of wealth and influence was unraveling with a precision that delighted and reassured me in equal measure. I sipped my coffee slowly, keeping my mind clear, reviewing each alert, each notification, each bounced email. This was not chaos. It was pattern, evidence, and consequence all at once. Theodore had trusted me to act with patience. And now that patience proved more formidable than confrontation would ever have been. The stress, the panic, the scrambling, all of it reinforced the truth they had never anticipated. Their sense of entitlement had no foundation without my consent. By late afternoon, I had begun organizing notes on their reactions, categorizing the severity of their panic and the potential outcomes for each failed action. Every misdirected call, every shouted question, every desperate attempt to reclaim control was logged, carefully considered, and folded into the strategy I had been silently constructing. The storm was no longer invisible. It had begun to shape their day, dictating behavior, emotions, and decisions without me ever needing to raise my voice. Even in their turmoil, I maintained composure. Each missed transfer, each denial of access was a deliberate stroke, a reminder of authority quietly exercised. While they floundered, I cataloged, analyzed, and considered the next phase. They assumed chaos was accidental. I knew it was deliberate, controlled, and complete. As the sun began to lower, stretching shadows across my desk, the first waves of realization had fully hit the family. Marin's repeated attempts at rationalization, Callum's frantic calls, and their growing inability to anticipate what would happen next confirmed the power shift I had orchestrated. The storm had begun, and I, at its quiet center, was already planning the next wave of consequences. I had watched Linnea closely over the years, noticing the way she looked me in the eye, how she treated responsibility with care, and how her questions were always rooted in honesty rather than expectation. Unlike Marin and Callum, she never assumed entitlement, never let arrogance guide her choices. Tonight, I decided to acknowledge that. The lake house had always been Theodore's favorite escape, the place where we celebrated milestones, patched fences, and watched seasons shift over the quiet water. It had been a symbol of our family's hard work and devotion. I opened the papers and signed the transfer into Linnea's name, the weight of the pen in my hand, carrying years of intention and validation. Later, I called her, making sure she was alone, and explained gently that the lake house, along with a few other properties and accounts, would now be hers. I spoke slowly, letting her absorb the words. There was a pause, then a tremor of disbelief in her voice. "Grandma, I don't know what to say. I don't deserve this," she whispered. "You do," I told her. "You've always acted with integrity, with care. This isn't about inheritance. It's about honoring the person you've been while others took shortcuts." She let out a soft breath, almost as if she had been holding it for years. The weight of responsibility was new to her, but it was earned, and she understood the gravity without needing a lecture. I could hear the gratitude, the shock, and a hint of pride in her tone, and it warmed something inside me. This wasn't just about wealth. It was about values, about showing that fairness and honesty had tangible weight even when others' greed threatened to overshadow them. Linnea's quiet awe and tentative joy stood in stark contrast to the turmoil consuming her parents, a reminder that character could not be bought, only nurtured. I guided her through the logistics, calmly explaining what the transfers meant, how she would manage the property, and that I would always be there for guidance. She thanked me, but I assured her this was her moment, hers to hold, hers to honor. In that brief conversation, I felt the balance of the family shifting not in anger, not in vengeance, but through recognition of integrity of heart. As I signed off the call, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle over me. The first tangible act of justice had been completed, and it reaffirmed the principle that guided everything Theodore had planned. Everything I had prepared for actions rooted in fairness held more power than any threat or punishment ever could. With Linnea acknowledged and the property transferred, I turned my attention back to the binder on my desk, ready to begin the next phase of recalibrating the family dynamics and confronting the deeper consequences of greed. The stack of notarized documents on my desk had grown heavier over the last few days, each folder a symbol of authority finally asserted. I reviewed them one last time, ensuring that every signature, every transfer, every account reassignment was accounted for. Nolan had guided me meticulously, and now, after hours of double-checking and coordinating with banks, title companies, and investment managers, the final pieces were in place. The fraudulent accounts Marin and Callum had manipulated were closed, every property and investment securely transferred under my legal name. I confirmed each action with a quiet, deliberate rhythm. Emails from brokers and accountants pinged one by one, each message reinforcing the authority I now held. The lake house was Linnea's. The downtown condo was reassigned, all joint accounts dissolved, and every loophole Theodore had anticipated was sealed. Each confirmation felt like a calculated move on a chessboard, complete, irreversible, and elegant in its execution. I paused and allowed myself a moment to breathe. Years of preparation, careful observation, and disciplined patience had brought me to this moment. I could feel the power flowing through the structure Theodore had built, a quiet but undeniable command. He had anticipated the greed, the entitlement, the hubris, and he had ensured that when the time came, I would have both the authority and the clarity to act decisively. I called Nolan again, not out of necessity, but to confirm the final steps and to ensure the estate managers, the property administrators, and all relevant parties were aligned. His voice was calm, professional, but I could hear the subtle respect underneath. "Everything is now under your control, Serafina," he said. "Every authorization, every account, every property. Legally, you are the sole decision-maker. Anyone attempting to override this will find the law firmly on your side." I leaned back, absorbing the weight of those words. It was not triumph in the sense of vindictive victory, but a profound acknowledgement of responsibility and rightful authority. I had been underestimated for years, dismissed, ignored, and belittled. Yet here I was, standing at the intersection of legality and moral certainty. Everything Theodore and I had built was now safeguarded beyond the reach of those who had assumed entitlement without effort, without vision. As the afternoon wore on, I reviewed the final communications one by one. Property titles confirmed, account closures, verified investment transfers acknowledged. Nolan reminded me that the system would flag any unauthorized attempts to access funds or property, and I felt a sense of calm satisfaction. The mechanisms were in place. The consequences for interference were automatic. I reflected briefly on Moran and Callum, the children who had believed the world was theirs for the taking. They had assumed ignorance, assumed my passivity, assumed that my role as a widow rendered me powerless. I smiled faintly, a quiet satisfaction settling over me. Their arrogance had not only been misplaced, but had left them unprepared for the certainty that now governed every asset. Everything was set, all formalities completed, and the foundation for the confrontation I had been preparing for was ready. The storm I had orchestrated was complete in structure, waiting only for the moment it would make itself fully known. I folded the final papers, neatly placing them on top of the binder, where every irregularity, every fraudulent transaction, and every strategic decision had been logged. With the legal framework secure and every safeguard in place, I allowed myself a brief, measured smile. The time for action had come. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, hands folded over the binder on my lap. The house looked exactly as it always had, pristine, orderly, calm. But I knew the calm was an illusion, a thin veneer that would crack the moment I stepped inside. I carried the binder deliberately, feeling its weight, each folder inside a symbol of the authority I had quietly reclaimed. Maren opened the door before I could knock, a practiced smile plastered on her face. Callum hovered behind her, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, eyes darting, as if trying to anticipate what I had in mind. I smiled faintly, a quiet, measured smile that said nothing, and yet conveyed everything. "Hello?" I said. My voice was calm, deliberate, almost casual. Grandma Maren said, her tone clipped. "We weren't expecting." She paused, the words catching somewhere between curiosity and irritation. I ignored the hesitation, stepping inside, setting the binder on the counter with a soft but deliberate thud. Every eye in the room shifted to it immediately. This I began, placing a hand flat against the top of the binder, contains every legal document, every account record, every property deed, and every transaction that has passed through your control without authorization. I let my gaze sweep over them slowly, deliberately. Maren's mouth tightened. Callum's eyebrows lifted in surprise, but they remained silent. "You've assumed entitlement for too long," I continued. "You've acted as though everything Theodore and I built over decades was yours to manipulate, to divert, to claim. You've made decisions, signed documents, and redirected funds without consent, without authority, and without integrity." Callum opened his mouth, likely to argue, to diminish what I was saying, but I raised a hand, stopping him mid-word. "Save it. Every action you've taken is documented, notarized, and legally invalid. Every asset you believed was yours is now under my sole authority. There are no loopholes, no exceptions, no negotiations." Maren's composure faltered, the practiced smile slipping just enough to reveal tension beneath. "That's impossible," she said, her voice strained. "You can't just—" I let the silence stretch, letting the weight of the statement hang between us. The binder itself seemed to swell with authority, the papers inside unyielding, immovable. I opened the top folder and began laying out the evidence in plain sight. Frozen accounts, notarized transfers, property deeds, proof of unauthorized transactions, and signatures that had been forged or manipulated. Each page added a tangible weight to my words, each fact a silent hammer driving the point home. Maren's hands trembled slightly as she reached for a document, but I withdrew it just enough to prevent any interference. Callum's face had gone pale, a mixture of disbelief and growing fear. This can't be binding," he stammered. "There has to be a way to reverse." "There isn't," I said softly, firmly. "Everything Theodore and I built has been protected. Everything you assumed was yours without effort has been reclaimed. Legally, morally, and irrevocably, the authority rests here." I tapped the binder lightly for emphasis. Maren's voice rose slightly, frustration leaking through the cracks in her usual control. "You're just trying to humiliate us, I interrupted, calm and deliberate. "This isn't humiliation. It's consequence. You were given every opportunity to act with honesty and integrity, and you chose otherwise. The storm you are experiencing now is the direct result of those choices, and it is entirely avoidable for those who act correctly in the future." I leaned back slightly, letting my presence dominate the room without aggression. Linnea, standing quietly in the corner, watched with wide eyes, understanding perhaps more than her parents. Her glance met mine briefly, and I offered a small nod of reassurance. The contrast between her composure and her parents' panic made the truth even sharper. I gathered the documents slowly, leaving them spread across the counter, as if inviting reflection. Everything you believed you controlled is no longer in your hands. Take a moment to absorb that. My gaze lingered just long enough to ensure they felt the weight of their actions without me raising my voice further. The room fell into tense silence, the kind of silence that stretches, bends, and settles heavily, leaving no space for immediate rebuttal. I stepped toward the door, collecting the binder, and paused. The power dynamics had shifted entirely, and the consequences were now unavoidable. I set the binder on the table again, letting the papers spread just enough to be impossible to ignore. Maren and Callum shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between each other, and me searching for some foothold in a situation they could neither control nor dismiss. I let them squirm. Patience had taught me that discomfort was a tool far more effective than anger or shouting. Let's review the facts. I began, my voice calm, deliberate. Every unauthorized transfer, every forged signature, every attempt to manipulate accounts or property is documented. Every action you took outside of legal authority is clear, undeniable, and irreversible. I paused, letting the words sink into the spaces between us. The tension in the room thickened, but I did not flinch. Callum opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to interrupt, perhaps to diminish the weight of my statement, but I raised a hand, stopping him mid-word. No explanations, no excuses. This is not about emotion, it is about accountability. You assumed entitlement where none existed. You acted as if the years of labor sacrifice and trust could be overridden by audacity and convenience. Maren's lips pressed into a thin line. We thought she began, and I shook my head, slowly letting her words falter. You thought incorrectly. You assumed ignorance, assumed passivity. Every assumption was met with foresight and preparation. Every attempt to claim authority without merit has failed. Legally, morally, and ethically, you are accountable. I leaned slightly forward, making deliberate eye contact. I am not here to humiliate. I am here to clarify. The actions you took were choices, and choices have consequences. Theodore entrusted me with the authority to protect the estate, and I have executed that trust fully. You cannot undo it. You cannot reinterpret it. It exists immutable, and every record supports it. Callum's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. This isn't fair. We grew up here. We thought we were entitled to decisions. I allowed a faint sigh, not of frustration, but of clarity. Entitlement is earned through integrity, through honesty, and through respect for the law. It is not inherited automatically because of proximity, age, or relationship. You failed to act with any of those qualities. That is the principle guiding these actions. Maren's eyes flicked toward Linnea, who stood quietly observing her expression, steady and thoughtful. I smiled just slightly at the contrast. One child had demonstrated responsibility and moral compass. The others had demonstrated hubris and short-sightedness. The difference could not have been more clear. You may feel wronged, and that is natural when consequences conflict with expectation. I continued, my tone steady, measured. But your discomfort does not change the facts, nor does it alter the authority vested in me. The estate, the accounts, the properties, and the responsibilities tied to them have been secured. You have no recourse, no exceptions, and no argument that will reverse what has been done. I allowed a long pause, letting the weight of the moment press down evenly on all of us. My composure was deliberate. It was a shield and a statement. My moral authority was not derived from anger or fear, but from clarity, consistency, and the record of my actions. Finally, I gathered the papers, stacking them neatly into the binder once more. Let this be understood fully. The estate will be managed under integrity, transparency, and fairness. Any further attempt to claim authority without merit will be met with the full weight of legal enforcement. The boundaries have been set, and they are unyielding. I stepped back. slightly giving them space to absorb the finality of the moment. My presence, calm and assured, left no room for misinterpretation. The consequences of their actions were clear, the moral and legal authority undisputed, and the foundation for the next phase of accountability fully established. By the time the first official notices arrived, the weight of reality had begun to settle on Marin and Callum like a slow, suffocating fog. I watched from my desk as Nolan confirmed the filings, the legal motions and the notifications sent to the bank's title companies and investment firms. Each notice was precise, methodical, and undeniable, a reflection of the careful preparation Theodore had instilled in every document he left behind. Marin's first call came in voice sharp, high-pitched, a mixture of disbelief and defiance. "This isn't happening," she said, her words rushing in a desperate flood. "You can't. These are our accounts. You can't just—" I waited for a beat, letting the silence press against her. "I can. And I have," I said evenly. "Everything you assumed you had authority over is secured legally and irrevocably. Every attempt to manipulate, misrepresent, or control has been documented and nullified. Your actions are now consequences you must face." Callum's call followed shortly after. Quieter, more tentative, tinged with disbelief. "Mom, I didn't realize. I thought I was managing things responsibly," he stammered. There was a hesitation in his voice, a flicker of guilt I hadn't heard before. "I didn't mean to." "You did," I said softly, deliberately, letting each word land with clarity. "You meant to act outside of authority, to assume entitlement, to benefit from what you had no right to claim. Intent doesn't erase accountability." Linnea, standing quietly in the doorway, observed the exchanges with wide eyes. Her presence was steady, a subtle reassurance amidst the storm. I caught her gaze and nodded slightly. She understood the significance, even if she didn't yet grasp the full scope of what had transpired. She had always been the moral witness, the one who saw truth where others saw convenience. Her silent support was more powerful than any argument I could make. Over the next few hours, the tangible consequences unfolded. Marin's attempts to access credit lines were blocked automatically. Transfer requests she had assumed would go through failed with precise, unyielding notifications. Callum discovered the frozen accounts and the reassignment of investment holdings. Each failure, each denied action, was a reflection of the careful orchestration I had implemented, and I observed it all with calm, measured attention. Legal representatives began contacting both Marin and Callum, detailing the ramifications of their unauthorized actions. Marin's signatures on certain documents were challenged as forged or invalid, and she was informed that continued attempts at interference could result in additional penalties. Callum received notices of his misappropriations, with auditors confirming the discrepancies he had created. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice. The law, the documentation, and the meticulous preparation Theodore had left me were sufficient to deliver consequence. I took a moment to record each development, noting reactions, emotional responses, and attempts at negotiation or deflection. The family was finally comprehending the breadth of their losses, the seriousness of their miscalculations, and the permanence of the authority I now held. They had assumed ignorance, assumed passivity, and now they faced the reality that each assumption had been calculated and countered in advance. Throughout it all, Linnea remained a quiet presence, occasionally offering a concerned glance, a tentative word of support, a reminder that integrity could still be rewarded. She did not intervene, nor did she need to. Her understanding, her awareness, and her moral steadiness were enough to reinforce the lessons being delivered. By evening, the first ripple effects were fully apparent. Marin's credit lines were restricted, Callum's investments frozen, and attempts to maneuver around the legal safeguards met immediate failure. I leaned back in my chair, watching the consequences take root without further interference. Justice, in its precise, deliberate form, had been delivered. The documents were in place, the legal motions executed, and the family was beginning to understand the weight of their choices, the reality of accountability, and the clarity of rightful authority. I allowed myself a quiet exhale, aware that the next steps would solidify what had been set in motion and pave the way for rebuilding the life Theodore and I had created. The morning air was crisp as I walked through the front hall binder and documents neatly stacked on the counter behind me. The storm of the past days had settled, leaving quiet in its wake. I poured myself a cup of coffee, inhaling the familiar aroma, and let the weight of authority and clarity rest on my shoulders. The estate, the accounts, the properties, they were all secured, fully documented, and legally beyond dispute. I began with organization, meticulously reviewing each asset and property, ensuring every transfer, every title, every investment was in place exactly as it should be. It was methodical work, the kind that required both focus and patience, and I found a quiet satisfaction in each completed checklist. Theodore had always believed in preparation, in anticipating the unexpected, and now I understood the depth of that foresight. The documents were not just legal instruments, they were a map, a guide to restoring balance, and I followed it with precision. While reviewing property records, my thoughts drifted back to the early days, the small house Theodore and I bought. Together, the cramped kitchen where we pored over contracts, and the late nights spent reconciling every dollar, every ledger. Each sacrifice, every deferred pleasure, every skipped vacation had contributed to the foundation I now safeguarded. That foundation had withstood the weight of betrayal, ignorance, and entitlement, and it had delivered me to this moment, fully capable of steering the course. After securing the estate, I turned to the future. I drafted plans for the Henry Whitlock Second Chance Fund, a grant program for widowed women over 60 who had been marginalized, ignored, or left vulnerable after the deaths of their spouses. The idea had been Theodore's seed, but it was mine to cultivate now. I outlined the structure, the selection criteria, the distribution of funds, and the administrative framework. Each detail was carefully considered, ensuring the fund would operate efficiently, fairly, and sustainably. Linnea had visited that morning, her eyes wide with curiosity, as I explained the fund and its purpose. "Grandma, this is incredible," she said, her voice quiet, awed. "You're really turning everything into something positive." I smiled, feeling a mix of pride and quiet joy. "It's not about me," I said. "It's about what we can do with what we have to help others, the way Theodore and I always believed in responsibility and foresight." She nodded, absorbing the lesson with a seriousness beyond her years. I also began reviewing personal routines and boundaries. Independence was no longer an abstract concept, but a tangible reality. I planned travel, professional projects, and social engagements with the freedom to choose unencumbered by interference or expectation. Each decision reinforced the authority and autonomy I had reclaimed, the life I could now live on my own terms. As I worked through the day, I reflected on the nature of foresight and resilience. Theodore had taught me the value of preparation, the power of patience, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing one's own worth. Betrayal had been a catalyst, yes, but it had also cleared the path for clarity and decisive action. Each document, each transfer, each strategic move was a testament to the work we had done, the principles we had followed, and the enduring capability I now wielded. By late afternoon, the estate was organized, the fund outlined and operational in principle, and my schedule mapped out for the next several weeks. I sat back in the study chair, looking at the neatly stacked papers, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. The storm had passed, the consequences had been delivered, and the groundwork for rebuilding, for thriving, had been laid carefully, deliberately, and successfully. With a final sip of coffee, I set the cup down and opened a fresh notebook to outline my next steps. The estate was secure, the fund ready to launch, and my independence fully restored. The path forward was mine to navigate, and I was prepared to do so, with the same clarity and determination that had guided me through every challenge. The invitation arrived in the mail, elegant and formal, but I recognized the underlying motive immediately. Maren and Callum were attempting to orchestrate a family gathering, a display of unity they assumed I would attend in submission. I read it once, then twice, folding it carefully. This time, I would attend not to negotiate, not to placate, but to assert presence to remind them that the authority I held was real and unassailable. I dressed deliberately, selecting attire that reflected both dignity and calm confidence. A necklace Theodore had given me decades ago rested against my chest, a small but potent reminder of the partnership and trust we had shared. Linnea smiled at me from the doorway, offering silent support, and I returned it with a nod. She understood that my purpose was presence, not performance. Arriving at the house, I observed the familiar scene, a backyard set with plastic tables and chairs, the hum of polite conversation, and the subtle tension in every movement Maren and Callum made. They glanced my way, their expressions betraying a mixture of expectation, apprehension, and disbelief. I walked calmly across the grass binder, discreetly tucked under my arm, and placed myself at the edge of the gathering. Every eye followed, yet no one dared approach directly. I let the moment linger, allowing my quiet composure to settle over the space like an unspoken declaration. I spoke minimally, exchanging brief pleasantries, observing without interference, and letting the room feel the balance of authority that had shifted irreversibly. My presence alone was a statement I was not seeking approval, nor was I here to defend my position. It existed, established, and unchallenged. Throughout the gathering, I moved among the guests with deliberate ease, acknowledging Linnea's polite introductions to distant relatives, responding to a few words from neighbors, and allowing the family to observe rather than dictate. Each gesture reinforced the truth they could not argue. I was present, composed, and fully in command of the life and estate Theodore and I had built together. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows over the yard, I excused myself quietly. I walked toward my car with measured steps, the weight of dignity and self-respect settling comfortably in my chest. Behind me, Maren and Callum were left to process the quiet authority I had demonstrated. No confrontation, no harsh words, just presence undeniable and composed. Driving home, I reflected on the weeks past, the planning, the execution, the patience. I realized that reclaiming control, enforcing accountability, and establishing my independence had not been acts of revenge, but acts of self-empowerment. The life Theodore and I had built was secure, my integrity intact, and my purpose renewed. The horizon stretched ahead, open and unclaimed, and for the first time in years, I felt that every decision, every step, and every assertion of authority had led me here, unshakable, empowered, and undeniably whole.